get ready, because today we're diving into a period that's way more interconnected than people think. Medieval Europe, right?
Yeah.
A time that always seems kind of isolated when you read about it. But the sources you sent, total opposite.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. We think of globalization as this modern thing, but even centuries before that word existed, there were already these vibrant networks crisscrossing the globe. Between 1000 and 1500 CE, we see travel, trade, knowledge exchange, all connecting Western Europe to places as far away as China.
Okay, hold on. No internet, no airplanes. How are people even making these journeys back then? Talking about a long-haul flight.
Right. Imagine a scholar from Morocco, Ibn Battuta. In the 14th century, he traveled the equivalent of 44 modern countries.
Whoa, 44. That makes Marco Polo look like he just took a quick trip down the street.
Seriously. Ibn Battuta's journeys were massive, almost 3 times the distance, across Africa, the Middle East, Asia. And it's not just the distance. He was like this walking, talking cultural exchange. Through his travels, he encountered different legal systems, observed astronomical practices, probably brought back architectural ideas. He was like this one-man knowledge network.
Wow, that really changes how I picture him and this whole era. But what would make someone want to go on these massive journeys?
It was a mix of things. Trade, of course, was huge, merchants moving luxury goods across Eurasia along the Silk Roads, for example. But it wasn't just about money. Religion played a big role, too, like with Ibn Battuta's pilgrimage to Mecca.
Right, the Hajj.
Yeah.
It's amazing how that one event has been bringing people together for centuries.
Exactly. And these journeys weren't just about getting from point A to point B. They were more like these arteries, pumping knowledge and culture and ideas across continents.
Speaking of innovations, one of the sources mentions the magnetic compass. I mean, it seems pretty basic to us now, but
Yeah.
it totally revolutionized travel, right?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. The compass, which actually started out as a Chinese invention, became essential for navigating the open seas. Can you imagine setting sail without a reliable way to figure out your direction? Terrifying. The compass gave sailors the confidence to cross those vast oceans.
So one little tool, passed from east to west, opens up the entire world.
Pretty much. Trade routes boomed, exploration exploded, the exchange of goods and knowledge went into overdrive. It's crazy to think. Without it, who knows? The European voyages to the Americas might never have happened.
It's mind-blowing how something so small could have that much impact. And it wasn't just the compass, was it? What other advancements had a similar effect?
Oh, tons. Think about something as simple as the horse collar. Not exactly exciting, right? But this invention revolutionized European agriculture. It let horses pull heavier plows without choking, which led to more food, larger populations, and eventually surplus resources to fuel even more specialization in trade.
So even how you harness a horse can change the course of history. It really shows how interconnected everything is. But not all these connections were good, right? The sources mention the bubonic plague.
Yeah, the Black Death. Can't talk about this era without it. It's hard to imagine. Millions dead, entire communities wiped out. In the 14th century, it swept across Eurasia and North Africa, leaving this unimaginable fear and disruption in its wake.
One source mentioned it originated in China. Is that another example of those trade routes we were talking about?
Unfortunately, yes. It seems infected rodents carrying fleas that were infected with the plague, they traveled along the Silk Roads, spreading the disease really fast. It's a stark reminder that while interconnectedness can lead to progress, it can also have devastating consequences.
It's kind of scary how that's similar to some things we see happening today. But even with that tragedy, the sources talk about resilience too.
Definitely. Amidst all that loss, people and societies adapted, rebuilt, found ways to keep going. One source mentioned Francesco Petrarca, an Italian scholar who lived through the plague, and another talked about Ibn al-Wardi, a Muslim writer from Syria who documented it. Their writings offer these really valuable first-hand accounts of how people coped with this horrific event.
It reminds you that history isn't just dates and empires. It's about people who lived through these crazy times.
Absolutely. And their stories show this incredible capacity for resilience. Even when faced with unthinkable things, humans find ways to rebuild and reimagine the world.
So we've got travelers, trade routes, new technologies, a devastating pandemic. It sounds like this period was anything but isolated. The sources also mentioned something called the Golden Age of Islam. What made that time so special?
The Golden Age of Islam, roughly from the 8th to the 13th centuries, was a time of incredible intellectual and cultural growth within the Islamic world. Think groundbreaking advancements in math, algebra, plus astronomy, medicine, art, and architecture flourished.
Right, some of the sources mentioned those breathtaking mosques built during this time, like the one in Cordoba. What else made it a golden age?
Well, besides algebra, there were astrolabes, those intricate instruments used for navigation. And this era saw a clandestine rise of Sufism, this mystical branch of Islam focused on seeking a deeper connection with the divine.
Sounds like a period of explosive cultural and intellectual growth.
Yeah.
How did this golden age impact the world outside of the Islamic world?
Now that's where things get really interesting. The knowledge and innovations from the golden age of Islam didn't just stay there, they had this ripple effect that reached Europe.
You're kidding. So even the European Renaissance, which we always think of as this revival of classical learning, was actually influenced by ideas from the Islamic world.
Exactly. It really challenges that whole idea of cultures developing separately. The Renaissance, in so many ways, was a direct beneficiary of the advancements made during the golden age of Islam.
That's incredible. It goes against everything we're taught. So bustling trade routes, new technologies, a devastating pandemic, a golden age of knowledge, and we're just getting started. There's so much more to this period.
Oh, there's so much more to uncover. We haven't even touched on things like societal structures, the roles women played, or the complexities of religion in medieval Europe. But we'll jump into all of that right after we come back. Stay with us.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about a world that was way more connected than we usually think, with medieval Europe having these fascinating links to the East. But let's narrow our focus for a bit and look at life in Europe itself,
Hmm.
especially the roles women played. When I hear medieval women, I kind of think of those old storybooks stuck at home. Not a lot of agency.
It's a pretty common image a lot of people have. And it's true that those patriarchal structures were definitely there, but things were actually more complicated, especially in cities. Women in medieval Europe had opportunities that you might not expect.
Really? Like what?
So picture a busy medieval marketplace, right? You'd see female artisans selling their crafts, women negotiating deals as members of guilds. Some were even doctors and healers. One source mentioned that in 13th century Paris, a good chunk of those guilds had women in them.
Wow, so it wasn't all just housework and raising children.
Oh, no, not at all. Women were really important to how those towns worked, both the economics and the social side. They contributed to their families' incomes, ran their own businesses, and started to challenge those strict roles.
That's amazing. It's nothing like that damsel in distress thing we always see. Are there any stories about particular women who really broke the mold?
It's tough. A lot of those individual stories are lost to time, unfortunately. But just the fact that so many women were working as butchers, brewers, bakers, even moneylenders, that tells you something. They were essential.
It makes you think about those women finding their own way in a world dominated by men. So inspiring. Now let's switch gears a bit and talk about another big force in medieval Europe, Christianity. The sources mentioned these grand cathedrals, these big theological debates, and even this fascination with relics. Seems like religion was a part of everything.
It really was. You could say Christianity was the bedrock of medieval European society. It shaped how they saw the world, their values, and it had this huge influence on everything from art and literature to politics.
One source mentioned those cathedral schools that eventually became universities. How'd that happen?
Well, as Europe's economy grew and things got more complicated, there was a greater need for education. Bishops and archbishops saw that, and they set up schools in their cathedrals. They'd invite these famous scholars to teach. And these schools in places like Paris, Chartres, and Bologna, they became major centers of learning. Students came from all over Europe.
So it wasn't just religious stuff they were teaching.
Right. Of course, religious texts like the Bible were really important, but they also taught what we call the liberal arts, things like literature and philosophy. Students studied the works of those classical Latin authors, early Christian thinkers, even some translated texts from Greek philosophers, the big names, Plato, Aristotle.
Sounds like they were building a well-rounded education, even by today's standards. So how did those cathedral schools turn into universities?
So around the 12th century, you see both students and teachers starting to form these guilds to stick up for themselves. And these guilds, they went after official charters from the authorities, basically creating these self-governing institutions, the universities we know today.
So universities weren't just handed down from above, the people built them.
That's right. It shows the power of people coming together and that hunger for knowledge that defined that era. Speaking of important people, the sources also talk about a scholar who really changed how people thought in medieval Europe, St. Thomas Aquinas.
Oh yeah, St. Thomas Aquinas? I vaguely remember him from philosophy class. Wasn't he all about trying to reconcile faith and reason?
That's him. Aquinas, who was a Dominican friar and theologian, was hugely influenced by the rediscovery of Aristotle's works. And he was convinced that faith and reason weren't opposed to each other, but two sides of the same coin, two ways to get at the truth.
So instead of rejecting those old Greek ideas, he embraced them and made them part of Christian theology.
Exactly. His approach, what scholars call scholasticism, aimed to bring together the logical rigor of Aristotle's philosophy with the teachings of Christianity, trying to find that common ground that was Aquinas. It was this bold intellectual project that really echoed for centuries.
It's amazing to think about how, even in a society that was deeply religious, there was this space for intellectual exploration and debate. But the sources also mention that scholastic theology was mainly for the elite. The average person in medieval Europe wouldn't have been reading Aquinas, right?
That's true. For most people, Christianity was more about lived experience, the rituals, the sacraments, the devotion to saints. It gave them a sense of belonging and connection to something larger than themselves.
Okay, so we've got universities, big thinkers, a really religious population, but there's also a darker side to this period that we have to talk about: the Crusades. They've always struck me as a complicated and, to be honest, unsettling part of history.
They are really complex. The Crusades, these holy wars launched by European Christians, they wanted to take back territories in the Eastern Mediterranean, especially the Holy Land, from Muslim control.
The sources mention Pope Urban II. He's the one who really got the ball rolling with that first crusade in 1095, right? What was behind that call to arms? Was it purely about religion?
It's definitely more complicated than that. Religious zeal was a huge part of it, for sure, but you've also got political ambitions, economic interests, all mixed in there. Pope Urban II, in that famous speech he gave at the Council of Clermont, he made it seem like the Muslim Turks were a big threat to Christianity and told the European knights they needed to liberate the Holy Land.
So there was more going on than just faith.
Oh, yeah. The Crusades were fueled by this potent mix of religious belief, political gamesmanship, and, let's be honest, a desire for more land, wealth, and power over trade routes.
So what was the lasting impact of these holy wars?
The Crusades left this long shadow. They had a huge impact on both Europe and the Middle East. Even though they ultimately failed to get lasting Christian control over the Holy Land, they set in motion all sorts of unintended consequences that would change the course of history.
Unintended consequences. Like what? Did anything good come out of such a dark chapter?
It is kind of ironic, but the Crusades, even with all that violence, actually opened up more opportunities for cultural exchange between East and West. Think about it. You had European merchants and scholars coming into contact with all these new ideas, technologies, and goods from the Islamic world, and that had a big impact back home.
It's crazy how these wars, meant to make Christianity stronger, actually ended up bringing new ideas into Europe.
That's exactly it. The sources even mention how the Crusades led to the rediscovery of those Aristotle works we talked about earlier. They also led to the introduction of Arabic numerals to Europe. And they sparked this fascination with things from the East, like spices, silks, coffee, all these things that would eventually fuel the Renaissance and help Europe grow intellectually and economically.
It just goes to show that history is rarely simple. Even in the worst of times, things happen that have unexpected consequences that ripple outwards and shape the future in surprising ways. But let's change gears a bit and talk about. So we've journeyed across medieval Europe, right? Found these surprising connections to the East, and we've seen how everything from horse collars to the Crusades changed things. But we can't wrap up this dive into this interconnected world without talking about one more group: the Mongols.
The Mongols. They had this huge impact on everything. Remember those Silk Roads we talked about? Well, under leaders like Genghis Khan, the Mongols built this massive empire across Eurasia. And get this, they actually made those trade routes safer.
Wait, really? The Mongols, with their fierce warriors, made those routes safer and helped connect the world. I don't think of peaceful traders when I think Mongols.
Right. It's funny how that works. But their empire, even though it was built through conquest, it ushered in this period of relative peace and prosperity, what historians call the Pax Mongolica. More stability meant more movement, people, goods, ideas flowing across huge distances.
Wow, I never knew that about the Mongols. They accidentally helped connect the world through their conquests.
It's true. And it reminds us that history is never simple. Even the biggest empires have these complicated legacies. A mix of good and bad, what they meant to do and what happened by accident. The Mongols were a force of nature, but they were also, in a way, these accidental architects of a more interconnected world.
This has been amazing. It's incredible to think about these webs of connection. Travelers like Ibn Battuta, Busy trade routes, new technologies changing everything, religions shaping daily life, empires rising and falling. It really changes how you think about medieval Europe. It wasn't isolated at all.
Exactly. And that's what's so cool about these sources, right? They help us break down those old stories, the ways we try to squeeze history into these neat little boxes. It was a world that was always changing, cultures mixing, ideas traveling, setting the stage for the world we live in today.
It makes you wonder what connections we're making today without even realizing it. What's going to shape the future?
That's the best part of these deep dives. They're not just about the past. They get you thinking, make you curious about today and tomorrow. What happened in the 14th century or the 12th century? It's not that different from what's happening now, just on a different scale.
Like you said before, history is like a mirror. It shows us ourselves just from a different angle.
Exactly. And that's what I hope everyone takes away from this, that sense of wonder, that desire to keep asking questions, to see those surprising connections. The past might seem far away, but it's still part of us.
That's a great point. It seems like every deep dive leaves us with more questions than answers, but that's what makes history so fascinating. It never ends. Thanks to you for joining us on this journey, and thanks to everyone listening out there. We'll see you next time as we take another deep dive into the past.